Okay, wonderful. We are live on Facebook, and it's really great to be here. This is Yiddish Poetry as Holocaust Theology with Mr. Daniel Kraft. So as a bit of housekeeping, first of all, those joining us here on Zoom, I will be sending you an invitation to become a panelist. That does not obligate you to do anything at all. It just enables you, if you so choose, to turn your camera on. We love seeing your happy face reacting to the learning that we're doing. And you'll also be able to mute and unmute yourself when we have breaks for questions, answers, hopefully, or rebuttal questions, perhaps, and comments. And also, if you would like to volunteer to read particular texts that we're going over, you'll be able to do that. But of course, if you prefer to interact with us using the chat, that is available. You can just type questions, comments in there. I know a lot of folks like to use it as a sort of note-taking while we're waiting for those question and answer periods. If you're joining us on Facebook, good evening. You can put your questions and comments directly below this video in the comment section. I will keep track and bring them over here, make sure that we do our best to address them. And as I said, this is Yiddish Poetry as Holocaust Theology with Mr. Daniel Kraft. The philosopher Theodor Adorno famously or infamously said that poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. But for a generation of Jewish writers, poetry after and about Auschwitz was an essential way of grappling with and grieving for the Holocaust. Together we'll look at Yiddish poets who turned to verse to craft theological responses to the Shoah. We'll consider the ways that poetry can be a medium for theology, in addition to the specifics of these poets' work, asking questions like, how does the Shoah change their relationships to God and to Torah, and how can poetry express the inexpressible? So again, Yiddish language skills are not required for this course. Mr. Kraft took care of all that for us, thankfully. And Mr. Daniel Kraft is a writer, translator, and educator living in Virginia. He holds a master's from Harvard Divinity School, where he was a Harry Austrian Wolfson Fellow in Jewish Studies and a resident of the Harvard Center for Study of World Religions. He's taught in many venues in North America and Poland, and his writing, poetry, essays, and his translations are available in a number of different publications and on his Substack. So without further ado, Mr. Kraft, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Noah, and thank you so much for all of your work making this possible. I'm really grateful to be a part of Drisha's incredible programming, and thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. It's really nice to see many familiar names and faces here and many unfamiliar, but hopefully soon familiar names and faces here. Can everybody hear me okay before we really dive in? Great. So I'm gonna attempt the screen share, which always feels to me a little bit risky, like something's gonna go wrong, but it looks like we're good to go. Can everybody see this? Great. Awesome. So our topic tonight is Yiddish poetry as Holocaust theology. And we're going to be exploring the questions that you see here. In what ways is Yiddish poetry a medium for Holocaust theology? And how do Yiddish writers use poetry as a way of responding theologically to the Holocaust? So we'll be focusing on 4 European-born American Yiddish poets, Aaron Zeitlin, Kadya Molodowski, Jacob Gladstein, Yankov Gladstein, and Malka Chayfetz Tusma. So these are 4 wonderful poets. They're far from the only poets to write theological Holocaust poetry, but for both personal reasons, they're poets that I love, and arbitrary reasons, because we have a finite amount of time. These are the writers we'll be focusing on. So my goal tonight is not so much to present an academic argument or to explore theories of poetics or Holocaust theology. Instead, really, I want to share some poems that I love along with some thoughts about the ways that they participate in and contribute to theological conversations about the Holocaust. My hope is also to be able to foster conversation with all of you. We all know by now that that can be difficult in the Zoom format. So what I'm thinking we'll do is after each poet, I'll open up, we'll kind of take a pause from my talking, and we'll open up for questions and comments. So if you have a thought, just hold it until I say explicitly that we're opening up to conversation. We'll have several opportunities. And yeah, I think this is going to be great. Thank you all for tuning in. So before we dive into the poems, I want to offer a couple different overarching frameworks for this. So some bigger picture frameworks as you hear here. First is what I'm calling my polemical soapbox. So what I want to argue is that from a Jewish perspective, there's actually not a clear distinction between theology and poetry. We don't have the time, it's beyond the scope of the talk tonight to give a full kind of account of that. Yeah, and let's see, I'm trying to figure out how to adjust this screen for folks. Thanks for reaching out. Can everybody see okay, or is it hard to see some of the writings there? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, great. So yeah, so from a Jewish perspective, what I want to suggest is that there's not a clear distinction between theology and poetry. And in fact, what I want to suggest and what I think is going to be the basis for our topic tonight is that from the perspective of Judaism, poetry is essentially theological and theology is essentially poetic. And there are a lot of reasons that I think that. I think we find that in the Torah itself, in Parshat Vayelech, in the book of Deuteronomy, God says to Moses, write this shirah, the Hebrew word for poem. And while in the plain meaning of the text, it refers to a specific poetic text that God then says, Maimonides, Rambam, later tells us that this shirah, this poem, refers to the entirety of the Torah. So already from the Torah itself, we have an idea that Torah is poetry. And I think this appears in a lot of different places throughout our tradition. Midrash, which is of course one of the central classical Jewish theological forms, is a poetic form. The Talmud is poetic. Drisha is offering a class right now on the poetics of Mishnah. So I want to suggest, and I am happy to talk about this more later if there's interest, that a clear distinction between theology and poetry is actually foreign to Judaism. So we see this in an interesting kind of way, this distinction reflected, it's a typo there. David Ruskies and Anita Diamant, in their guide to Holocaust literature, they describe Yankov Glatstein, one of the poets we'll be looking at tonight. They say, with his book, Strahlen dicke Yidden, Radiant Jews, his first post-war collection of poems, Glatstein became a theologian, not merely a poet of the Holocaust. And I bring that up as a sort of way of illustrating the framework that I don't want to have tonight. I think there's a lot of kind of funky, odd things about this statement, not least of which is this word merely, which establishes, to my mind, a hierarchy placing theology above poetry. But I would argue that first of all, there's no such thing as merely a poet of the Holocaust. But second of all, to be a poet of the Holocaust is already, by definition, necessarily to be a theologian. So that's the first kind of overarching framework that I want to suggest, that all Holocaust poetry and all Jewish poetry in general is theological. The second framework that I want to suggest is that literature, they say here, is where theology becomes concrete. So I'm fascinated by this statement here from Gershom Scholem. Now, this is from a speech he gave in 1930 in Jerusalem at a memorial event for the Jewish philosopher and theologian Franz Rosenzweig. Scholem was one of the towering scholars of the Jewish 20th century. So he said in this speech, theology is not a science of the essence of the divinity beyond creation, but consists rather of the eternal questions of love and will, wisdom and ability, judgment and mercy, justice and death, creation and redemption. Theology has concrete questions. In time, this theology took on an alien cast, in our times astoundingly abstract and anemic, as if abandoned by its subjects, which went off in search of another field. Is it at all surprising that with theology's status at its low point, even problems no one could doubt belong to it, have fled and have ensconced themselves in art and literature? So there's a lot we could say about this little passage as well. But one of the things that I love about these poems is that they take the themes and questions and concerns of theology and they remove them from abstraction. They ground them in the experiences of our lives. And that's what I see Sholem pointing to here as well. Theology can be abstract, it can be theoretical, but in art, the concerns of theology find a rootedness in actual human experiences and desires and questions and yearnings. And then the third little framework I want to offer is this idea here that poetry creates a space for contradiction. So John Keats, one of the greatest English poets of all time, in an 1817 letter to his brothers, he described what he calls negative capability. The negative capability, that is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Don't you love that phrase? Any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So what Keats is describing there is the power of poetry to create a space where we can be uncertain, where we can have our doubts and not try to force them into a resolution. It's also Keats's birthday today, by the way, so happy birthday, Keats. And then, of course, in our American poetic tradition, we have Walt Whitman in his Song of Myself. He writes, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." It's one of the great moments, I think, in the history of American poetry. So theology and philosophy and similar pursuits are often concerned with reason and consistency, but the lived experience of religious faith is not actually that rational or that consistent, especially in the modern world and in the aftermath of trauma, what it means to live a theological life. In other words, what it means not to do theology, but to live the questions of religion. It includes contradiction, includes ambivalence, faith and doubt alongside each other, for example. I think that, as these quotes show us, poetry's negative capability, in Keats's words, its ability to contain contradictions without forcing them into resolutions, makes poetry uniquely able to express not just the ideas of theology, but the actual lived questions and concerns and experiences of modern, especially post-Holocaust religion. So with that in mind, let's dive into some poems. So we're going to start with Aaron Zeitlin. You can see him pictured here. Aaron Zeitlin was born in 1898 in what's now Belarus. His father, Hillel Zeitlin, might be familiar to some folks here. Scrolling down because I love this picture of Hillel Zeitlin. So Hillel Zeitlin was a very influential mystic. He was a writer, a poet, a journalist. He's having a resurgence in some mystically inclined Jewish communities today. And here you see a later photograph of father and son together along with someone else. I tried to look up who this central figure here is, Zvi Weinberg, and I have no clue, couldn't find anything about him. So if anybody knows, please let me know. So Aaron Zeitlin, in a lot of ways, followed in his father's footsteps. He started writing professionally as a teenager. Through the course of his career, he wrote poetry, fiction, drama, essays. In his 20s, he settled in Warsaw along with most of his family. He was married, had a kid, and then in 1939, he went to New York for what was supposed to be a relatively temporary visit to work with Maurice Schwartz, who was then director of the Yiddish Art Theater in Manhattan on the production of one of his plays. So that was the summer of 1939. course, if you know anything about European history, the start of September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. So what was supposed to be a temporary trip became permanent. Zeitlin was unable to return to his family. He corresponded with them by letter for a while, and then during the war years, the letters stopped. And he had to live with the anguish of the uncertainty of what was happening to his family, along with the anguish of not being there with them in such a time. By the end of the war, he was his family's only surviving member. And the guilt and the trauma of this loss, the loss not just of all of his family, including his young child, but also the loss of his civilization, became one of the central themes of his writing. He died in 1973. One of the central themes, along with the Jewish mysticism that he inherited from his father. So I want to start by following the thread from the Jewish mystical tradition of his father and seeing how it comes into Zeitlin's poetry. So in June of 1939, we find Hillel Zeitlin, his father's last Hebrew publication. It was an essay which takes up a theme, much older theme from Jewish mysticism. And in this Hebrew essay, he wrote, "Is it not in our power, if we truly desire it, to give true expression to the words of the psalmist, and I am prayer, I myself, I with my whole being, with the entire spirit and soul within me, with all of my 248 organs and 365 sinews." Sorry, my little screen share emblem here is blocking the rest of this. Okay. With my all of my 248 organs and 365 sinews, spiritual and physical, behold, I am entirely prayer. I am entirely longing, thirst, and craving for God's kindness. So it's a beautiful kind of classical Jewish mystical idea. He's calling on his readers to become the prayer, not to have prayer be something distinct from them. Many years later, Aaron Zeitlin takes up this exact theme in this exact language. I will read this poem in Yiddish and then in English, but for the future poems, I'm going to open it up to anyone who wants to read in either language. So first in Yiddish, Ani Tfilah. Du hörst mein Tfilah, du sehst sie, wenn du guckst im Bläus an, mein Guf, dem Stück Heuschech ve'afela. Was is mein Tfilah und wer? Ich, dein zerbrochene Kli, Ani Tfilah. Ich Gufa, Gor, mein Heut und Gebein, ich allein bin die Tfilah. Mein Hand und mein Fuß, mein Oig und mein Euer, das alles ist Tfilah, mein Gott, Tfilah von Treuer. So hopefully you were able, even if you didn't understand the Yiddish, to pick up on some of the music and the rhyme of this poem. It's really a masterful short poem. In English, you hear my prayer, you see it. When you only look at my body, this scrap of dust and darkness, what is my prayer and who? I, your shattered vessel. I am a prayer. I am. My flesh and bones, all of me, I myself am the prayer. My hand and my foot, my eye and my ear, it's all a prayer, my God, a prayer of sadness. I love this poem. I find it exceptionally powerful. I mean, I could say that about every poem we're going to be talking about tonight, so I'll try to hold back. But there's a lot we could say about it. So his father requested of his readers to become their prayer. And here we see Aaron Zeitlin fulfilling his father's request. I am a prayer. But now, when Hillel Zeitlin talked about it, it was a prayer of yearning for God's kindness. Here, it's a prayer of sorrow, of sadness, and whatever wholeness his father thought a person could have in being a prayer is gone. He's a shattered person, a shattered vessel. So I wanted to start with this poem because I think it's a powerful example of the ways that post-Holocaust poetry takes up pre-war theological ideas in a continuous thread. Zeitlin isn't starting from scratch here theologically. He's continuing a theological conversation that his father had continued from his own predecessors. And yet, even as it's continuous, it's marked in Zeitlin's refiguring of it here by a new grief and trauma that wasn't present in his father's presentation of the theology. One question that I have about this poem, it's strange to me that he doesn't cite his father here. He says very explicitly, after a saying from Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Peshischa, whom his father was also citing, but it's very clearly a reference to his father's last Hebrew publication. So it's strange to me that he wouldn't be explicit about that. I don't really know how to read that omission, that absence. But yeah, so let's look at a few more of Aaron Zeitlin's poems. And I want to look at them from the theological framework of anti-theodicy, what we'll call anti-theodicy. So theodicy, the classical term for a justification of God, an attempt to vindicate divine goodness and justice in the light of suffering and evil. This is a term that was invented by the philosopher Leibniz, who maintained that this is the best of all possible worlds. So I want to cite this scholar, the contemporary scholar Zachary Braderman. So he talks about this idea of anti-theodicy. Anti-theodicy, he writes, mirrors theodicy in reverse, but should not be confused with atheism. Anti-theodic statements neither justify, explain, ascribe positive meaning, account for, resolve, understand, accept, or theologically rectify the presence of evil in human affairs. Rather, they express anger, hurt, confusion. They do not try to silence suffering people. So we might assume that theodicy is the standard classical Orthodox Jewish response to suffering. And certainly there's theodicy everywhere in classical Jewish sources, but there's also an important strain of anti-theodicy in classical Jewish sources. So if we look, for example, we see in the Talmud, Elisha ben Abuya says, there is no justice and there is no judge. He says this in response to the death of a child. Now, that's maybe not the best example because Elisha ben Abuya is the sort of archetypal heretic of the Talmudic period, but we don't need to turn to heretics to see this idea stated. So, for example, I'm interested in this statement from Breshit Rabbah, which is one of the classical Midrash collections, a commentary on the book of Genesis, comparing, it's a discussion of Cain and Abel and their struggle. And it says, it is difficult to say this thing, and the mouth cannot utter it plainly. Think of two athletes wrestling before the king. Had the king wished, he could have separated them, but the king did not so desire, and one athlete overcame the other and killed him. The killed athlete cried out before he died, let my cause be pleaded before the king. So it's a strange sort of parable, but I'm inclined to see this as a classical example of anti-theodicy, right? The victim here, in this case, maps onto Abel, says very explicitly, let my cause be pleaded before the king. God, King God, why did you not intercede here? You could have and you didn't. There's no easy answer that the classical rabbis are offering us. There's no theodicy. And of course, maybe the quintessential example of anti-theodicy is most of the book of Job, where Job insists that God is treating him unjustly and that God's justice cannot be vindicated in what is done to Job. So classical theodicy, I think, appears very little in Yiddish Holocaust poetry, but anti-theodicy is very, very common. So we're going to look now at a few poems of Aaron Zeitlin's that I see as expressing an anti-theodicy. I don't want to say too much about them. I don't want to over-theorize or over-analyze. Now that we've established this anti-theodicy framework, I just kind of want to try to let the poems speak for themselves, and hopefully you'll find them powerful and meaningful as well. So this poem takes up quite explicitly the book of Job, right? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Do we have any Yiddish readers in attendance who want to read the Yiddish of the poem?
Don't be shy. This is a friendly space. So
That's
you
right.
could just raise your hand or unmute and let us know.
So if not, I think in the interest of time, we'll skip a Yiddish reading for this one. And I'll just share the English. But I think you'll see why I understand this as an anti-theodicy poem. So where were you? From the tempest, God asked Job, where were you when I created Leviathan? Told choirs of young stars to sing, opened worlds and sealed abysses? You know nothing. You cannot accuse me. And Job lowered his head and said no more. Now God is silent. A Jew accuses him. Where were you? Where were you when the German tossed me in a gas chamber, burned me in his oven, made soap from my body to wash his cane hands, rendered humanity impure forever, toxified your whole holy creation like a toilet? God is silent. A Jew accuses him. Where were you? It's a remarkable poem for the way it completely inverts the classical ending of Job. And I'll just point out here, if you're not a Yiddish reader, I've translated this here, rendered humanity impure forever. The Yiddish is literally, it's gemacht auf ewig treif. So made humanity treif forever. So you can see why this is a poem that rejects any attempt to justify God's goodness or justice, and instead embraces quite explicitly a rejection of God's goodness and justice, and accuses God. Similarly, this short poem, Letters from the Warsaw Ghetto, Brief from Warschauer Ghetto. Does anyone want to read the English of this one?
I can do it. Do you want me to do it?
Awesome, thanks, Lenny. And Nathaniel, I saw your hand raised too, so
Okay.
thanks for that. We'll get you in a little bit.
Letters from the Warsaw Ghetto. Letters sent from the Warsaw Ghetto, hidden in muffled drawers. At night, when souls depart their bodies, you letters leave my drawers, burning with rage, and rise to press your charges against God, to file suit against heaven.
Thank you, Lenny. Yeah, it's just to me, this is just a devastating poem, in part because we can imagine him literally having in his drawers letters from his murdered family members from the Warsaw Ghetto. And here he fully embraces this anti-theodic stance. The letters themselves, interestingly, are what rise up to accuse God. These emblems of their absent writers. One interesting strain of his anti-theodicy that I want to point out, it rejects very explicitly one theodicy that sometimes comes up in Holocaust theology. So we see this theodicy here by Eliezer, in a statement by Eliezer Berkowitz. This is from his 1973 essay. He writes, only after the establishment of the state of Israel, which he sees as part of a messianic process, does Jewish history make sense. Does Jewish history make sense? It is part of the cosmic drama of redemption. In it, the massive martyrdom of Israel finds its significance. Nothing of the sorrow and the suffering was in vain, for all the time the path was being paved for the Messiah. So this is pretty explicitly a statement of theodicy, right? He's justifying God's ways in the Holocaust by saying, well, it culminated in the state of Israel. I'll put my cards on the table and say personally that I find this line of theodicy disagreeable at best. I'm being diplomatic there. And as we'll see, Aaron Zeitlin agrees with me. He doesn't like this either. So I'll just read this next poem in the interest of time. Give me back my world. When I appear before the celestial court, I'll need them to answer the questions which will surge in tidal waves from my heart. I'll need them to tell me whether the Shekhinah thinks that a child flung into an oven is redeemed now that Jews have a state. A state? From our blood, it rose up when the people broke their chains. And how much blood must we still spill? Who knows? But how can the two be compared? Even if we could have 100 states. Who cares? Is this the answer? The reward? What do you want? They will ask. What do I want? I want for what happened not to have happened, for what there was not to have been. I need to get back what I had. Give me back a world, give it back to me. It's another poem that I find kind of unspeakably devastating. But you see here, he explicitly rejects this claim of theodicy, this idea that there was a reason, that there could be some compensation for the suffering, that God had a plan that made it all make sense. In a kind of savage, brutal language, he shows how odious he finds that idea. And then I want to close with a final poem of his, where he turns from this theodicy to a different approach to things a little bit, and finds a way to redeem the possibility of faith. Nathaniel, your hand was up earlier. Do you want to read this one in English for us?
Sure, I would love to.
Awesome. Good to see you, by the way.
Likewise. Faith. Where is faith? If you would find its home, go ask despair. The path winds through its territory. Faith resides in ruins. Faith's tears flow across the bare foundation of a burnt-down building. The tears mirror a dawn whose glow illuminates the firmament above faith and above the ruins. In faith, tears' dawn shines while faith sits, wrings her hands. If you do not know despair, you will never find faith.
Awesome. Thank you, Nathaniel. So I want to argue that this poem is participating in and extending in the particular post-Holocaust context, a theme that we see in a lot of earlier Hasidic theology. So Menachem Mendel of Kotsk says this quite explicitly: nothing is as whole as a broken heart. And Yitz Greenberg, another important contemporary theologian, sort of takes this up in a similar way as well. He writes, after Auschwitz, there is no faith so whole as a faith shattered and refused, not refused, in the ovens. No faith so whole as a faith shattered and refused. Nothing as whole as a broken heart. For Aaron Zeitlin, we see that in this poem. Only through despair can you find faith. And what this suggests also is that someone who's never known despair will actually never know faith. Interestingly, though, I want to point out, he doesn't say that despair is a path to God. God is strangely absent from this poem. I don't quite know what to do with that. But I might have expected God to make an appearance here somewhere, right? Yeah, but it's just faith without the presence of God mentioned. So with that, I want to open up to questions, conversation, comments. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop Aaron Zeitlin here, but I would love to hear any thoughts or reflections that you have about anything we've discussed thus far. Either feel free to type if that's easier for you, or to unmute, or to request to unmute, whatever works for you. Yeah, so MK wrote, right, cites Esther here. That's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that, that kind of connection. The book of Esther is the only book of the Bible in which God is absent. God isn't mentioned. So there's a hiddenness that comes in there. It would be interesting to think of that hiddenness in Esther in terms of the hidden, in conversation with the hiddenness of some of these poems. I see you also wrote in the chat, was Saul Bellow familiar with Zeitlin? I don't know for sure, but Bellow was fairly, had a pretty good understanding of modern Yiddish literature. So I would imagine that he had at least some familiarity, but I really don't know. Yet doesn't faith presuppose God? What is it faith in? Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, what years were these poems? So the question about faith presupposing God, I think is true. I think there's an implicit aspect of like, yeah, like you find faith and that means faith in God. But I also think that we can think of faith here as a more expansive faith in humanity, faith in the possibility of oneself building a meaningful life after such trauma. I'm not saying that those are the only necessary or possible ways of thinking about it, or that God is actually absent here. But it does strike me that God isn't mentioned where we might expect God to be. What years were these poems written? It's a great question. I was looking in the collected poems, which he, for better and for worse, Aaron Zeitlin restructured his collected poems. So it's not entirely chronological and he doesn't give dates for everything. So I can double check and see, but none of them were obviously apparent. But interestingly, thinking again about, this idea that poetry creates a space for contradiction and that that's necessary for post-Holocaust theological poetry. His collected poems, which runs like 1,000 pages, it's an astonishing body of work, is called Lieder von Chorben und Lieder von Gläuben, poems of destruction and poems of faith. So that contradiction is built in to the name of the collected poems themselves. And I think what we find, as in this poem about faith and despair, is that the poems of destruction are the poems of faith. The poems of faith are the poems of destruction. That for Zeitlin, these things become intertwined with each other. Yeah. Gary writes, faith in Hebrew is often translated as emunah. How is this expressed in Yiddish? Emunah is an affirmation in spite of. Is this what is being expressed in these poems? I think it's a great question. I would say that I understand the faith in these poems as both at once in spite of and because of the suffering that he's experienced. Both faith, the suffering is an obstacle for his faith, but it's also an avenue to find it. So in the interest of time, let's continue on our journey here. I will return to my screen sharing, and we're going to jump now into Kadja Molodowski, our next poet. So Kadja Molodowski was also born in Europe. She emigrated to the United States as a young woman after living in many different European countries. She was born in what's now Belarus. We're going to look at two of her poems. They're both from her 1946 collection called Der Melech David Allein is geblieben, which means only King David remained. So in 1946, she's responding very immediately to the Holocaust, which was for her a personal tragedy, as it was for all of these writers in different ways. Her brother and his wife and their baby daughter were all murdered. And just like Zeitlin, she was in New York at the time, anxiously awaiting news from her loved ones. And I want to think about Kadja Molodowski in the context of a covenantal relationship to God, which is central to Jewish theology. So Yitz Greenberg, whom we mentioned earlier, important Holocaust theologian, he writes, morally speaking, God must repent of the covenant that is due to teshuva, repentance, for having given God's chosen people a task that was unbearably cruel and dangerous without having provided for their protection. Morally speaking, then, God can have no claims on the Jews by dint of the covenant. What then happened to the covenant? I submit that its authority was broken, but the Jewish people, released from its obligations, chose voluntarily to take it on again. This is a radical theological claim. In the Holocaust, the covenant broke, and we now, those of us who continue to participate, in Jewish religious life, we voluntarily maintain that covenant. But in Molodowski, we find an example of someone refusing to voluntarily maintain that covenant, rejecting it quite explicitly. This is a fascinating poem that we're going to look at. Again, in the interest of time, I feel sad doing this because we deserve to have the Yiddish sounds in our minds for this, but we're just going to read the English here. So this is called Merciful God. The Yiddish is Hebrew, El Chanun, which comes from the 13 attributes of mercy, which God instructs Moses to recite. But here, as you'll see, Molodowski kind of inverts God's instructions to Moses. So, merciful God, choose another people, elect another. We are tired of death and dying. We have no more prayers. Choose another people, elect another. We have no more blood to be a sacrifice. Our house has become a desert. The earth is insufficient for our graves. No more laments for us, no more dirges in the old holy books. Merciful God, sanctify another country, another mountain. We have strewn all the fields and every stone with ash, with holy ash. With the youthful and with babies, we have paid for every letter of your 10 commandments. Merciful God, raise your fiery brow and see the peoples of the world. Give them the prophecies in the days of awe. Your word is babbled in every language. Teach them the deeds, the ways of temptation. Merciful God, give us simple garments of shepherds with their sheep, blacksmiths at their hammers, laundry washers, skin flayers, and even the more base. And do us one more favor. Merciful God, deprive us of the divine presence of genius. It's a searing poem in which she explicitly says, yes, this covenant is not broken. I wish it were. Please break it, God. End our chosenness. I'll point out some interesting things in the Yiddish here. This very last line, Nehm zu von uns die Shechina von Geonis. So what, this is a Catherine Hellerstein's translation, by the way. So what Catherine Hellerstein translates as the divine presence of genius. That word divine presence is Shechina, which if you're familiar with Hebrew mysticism especially, but not exclusively, is the sort of divine feminine indwelling presence of God. Take the Shechina from us. It's just to me a totally searing poem in which she wants to be entirely done with this idea of covenant, with this idea of chosenness. It seems to her in this poem to be exclusively the province of death and suffering and oppression. So against Yitz Greenberg's claim that we voluntarily maintain the covenant, she says, no, we are involuntarily trapped within it. We'll look at one more poem of hers in which I think she continues this theme. This is from the same 1946 collection, a tefillah, a prayer. Does anybody want to read the English for this one?
Surely.
Awesome. Thank you.
I arise at dawn, and my prayer is poison. I ask that the deluge shall come again, raising the surge of the ocean higher than towers and rooftops. The rescuing ark shall not float. Oh, how good it is. Oh, how good it will be, death's cold touch. Perhaps it will put out my limbs' sickening pain, the heart's desolation, the disgrace of chewing bread near the ash heap of brothers and sisters. Oof.
Yeah.
Oh, how good it will be to touch the clouds in the annihilating flood. Perhaps there I'll sense the ultimate sweetness, hear in the ash flying forth from bodies a voice, and closing the circle of life, I will silence the pain.
Thanks, Jamie. It's a brutal poem, isn't it? I mean, it really doesn't pull its punches. I think it's important to note here that these are written, as I said, this book was published in 1946. I think this poem was actually written in 1945. So it was written not reflecting after the fact, in hindsight, but when the extent of the genocide was really just becoming clear. And I think that accounts for the rawness of the pain that this poem expresses. Kaja Molodowski is not always this much of a downer, although I think she deserves, she's entitled to be. I think it's an incredible poem. And I want to point out in this last poem we looked at, she rejected the Jewish people's covenant with God. But in Parshat Noah, in the Noah story, God creates a covenant with humanity, right? With the rainbow as its emblem, not to destroy the world again. Here, she wants that covenant undone as well. She wants not just the Jewish people's particularity erased, but actually life itself. And Jamie, you went oof when you read that line, the disgrace of chewing bread near the ash heap of brothers and sisters. That hits me every time as well. And to me, that's the key of the poem. I mean, how can one continue living? She's asking, in a world which is so degraded by murder. And her answer, at least in this poem, keeping in mind, of course, that poems are spaces for contradiction, and she doesn't have to be consistent in this. Her answer here is that she can't continue living. It's not worth it. It's not possible. It's not moral. So let's go ahead and, again, in the interest of time, I'm going to stop Kaja Molodowski there, and I would love to hear anybody's thoughts. I know this is a lot and it's kind of rushed, so I'm grateful to you all for hanging on with me, but I do see some great notes in the chat here. The irony of referring to a merciful God. It's lacerating, isn't it? I mean, the irony there. You have the sense that she just, I have the sense reading this, that she just wants God to feel how horrible this is. Judith, were you going to say something?
Yes. Of course, the ultimate contradiction is that she's writing poetry in Yiddish and having totally biblical allusions. She has not let go of her Jewishness, nor has she let go of being a human being. She's a poet. So the ultimate contradiction is that the very references, the form she uses, keeps her linked no matter how much she's trying to push away.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Judith. And I think that goes to the title of this poem as well, which Jamie pointed out, a tefillah, a prayer. It's a kind of anti-prayer prayer, but it's a prayer nonetheless. And that is what is, to me, so haunting about these poems, right? And such a good example of Keats's negative capability. She can have a prayer that rejects the possibility of prayer. She can have a poem in a Jewish language that refuses what it means to be Jewish. Both of those things can be true at once. Aidan asked a great question here. The poetics and sounds of some of these poems perform theology. That is, how do they help work through questions of faith, suffering, etc.? What is or threatens to be lost in translation? It's a phenomenal question. There's a lot that we could say about it, but I'll just point out one aspect of this, which is the etymology. So Yiddish speakers generally had what linguists refer to as a high level of component consciousness, which means essentially an understanding of the etymology of their words, what language groups their words come from. So we in English don't generally think about like, oh, did I just use a word with a Latin root or a Germanic root? But Yiddish speakers were very, very aware of this, and skillful Yiddish writers use this and are very deliberate in where they do and don't use words that come from Hebrew or Aramaic and that carry, therefore, these kind of biblical and theological associations. So that's something that I think is entirely lost in translation. But if you are a reader of this in Yiddish, even from the title of this poem, a tefillah, a prayer, That's the Hebrew word for prayer. It's not a Yiddish word. So it's explicitly claiming its place within a classical Jewish theological and liturgical lineage, right? If it were a Germanic word for prayer, I think it would read as something very different. The fact that the title is the Hebrew word for a prayer tells us that even as she is rejecting all of this, she still is claiming a place within it in some important way. I don't know if that exactly gets to your question, Aidan. There's a lot more that could be said about this. Yeah, Isaac, did you want to say something?
Just wanted to mention that anti-theodicy suggests that not that one is an atheist, as we read earlier in this presentation, but that there's sort of a relationship with God. You're angry with God. You can't let go, really. You know, you're still in some kind of relationship, which is very different than if it would be atheism, then, or simply not caring. There's this sense of the covenant being broken, lovers' contract being broken, and there's a lot of anger and rage around it, but not a total denial of God's existence.
Yeah, I think that's well said and very true. These would be very different poems, and to me at least, less interesting if they just said, this is obviously evidence that God does not exist. The fact that they're maintaining this contradictory stance of having such rage and grief against God, calling on God to destroy the world, even from within this place of such suffering and such rejection of what it means generally to believe in God, makes it all the more powerful. Yeah, well, every single one of these poems could and should be, you know, an hour's discussion in itself. So thank you for bearing with me as we sort of rush through these. So I want to look now, we don't have that much time left. So instead of looking at some of this theology, let's just dive right into this poem by Yankov Glatstein. Yankov Glatstein, I'll just say briefly, was one of the really greatest Yiddish writers of the 20th century. He emigrated as a young man to New York, worked in sweatshops, went to law school at NYU, but by 1920, he, in his early 20s, he really devoted himself fully to writing. He wrote essays, novels, criticism, but he's really considered one of the greatest Yiddish poets. And also in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, he wrote some of the most enduring poems about it. So let's go ahead and read in English his poem, My Wander Brother. My wander brother. I love my sad God, my wander brother. I like to sit with him on a stone and silence to him all my words. When we sit like this, dumbfounded together, our thoughts merge in one stillness. My weary God lights a cigarette and inhales the first smoke. A star lights up, a fiery sign. His limbs long for sleep. The night lies at our feet like a lamb. My beloved God, how many prayers to him have I profaned? How often have I blasphemed in the nights, warmed my fearful bones at the fire pot of knowledge? And here he sits, my friend, hugging me, and shares with me his last mouthful. The God of my unbelief is beautiful. How nice is my feeble God now, when he is human and unjust. How graceful is he in his proud downfall, when the smallest child revolts against his command. Through sea and land, we two shall ever wander and wander together. I think to my dozing God of myself. At times, an alien space will spread in the homiest warmth. And before you grasp its mystery, you feel how your own futility blossoms like moss on a gravestone. Is this the city that I built? Is this the street I confided in every night of my memory? How many summers appeared here in my dream? Here I came to strike roots and grow stems. Here I wanted to plant calm on my own living graveyard of father, mother. I had plenty of death over there. I came here, an heir of death, a refugee. You are talking of yourself, answers the silence of my wander brother. And I think of all of us. How much destruction can a people bear and still believe in rebuilding? Now groveling in the dust, my people is holier than me. One day nations shall come to bow to its pain. But God, my brother, why hast thou raised my people and spread their misfortune like stars all over the sky? Pain, blood, pierced hands, pity of emptied veins. A childish fable with silly words, I multiplied it by 6 million. I gave the fable its moral. My people, my son, my dream will blossom forever crucified on a tree of light. My God sleeps and I watch over him. My tired brother dreams the dream of my people. He dwindles, grows small as a baby, and I rock him into the dream of my people. Sleep, my God, my wander brother, sleep into the dream of my people. It's a wild poem, isn't it? So since we're running out of time, I thought it would be nice to end on this poem, although officially we'll end, but I'm happy to stay and chat and continue talking about this as long as people would like. Officially we'll end on this poem though, because I think it captures everything we're talking about here. There are a few moments that I want to point out to you, and then we'll open up for continuing thoughts, questions, conversation. So first of all, I love this line, the God of my unbelief is beautiful. In all of the ways we're talking about here, it's a poem that has its cake and eats it too, if you will, when it comes to belief and atheism. How nice is my feeble God now when he is human and unjust. So at the same time, this is a God, and yet this is a God that's feeble, that after the Holocaust have been reduced to this kind of human state of incapability and misfortune. And yet this is a beloved God. This is a God identified as brother. I also want to point out here a fascinating topic in itself, which is Gladstein's use of the crucifixion imagery. This is presumably God talking. My people, my son, my dream will blossom forever, crucified on a tree of light. It's a kind of wild image. I don't quite know how to see it exactly, but if you try to visualize it, it's really arresting. And what I think Gladstein is doing here is trying to reclaim this image of Jesus's suffering and take it back from Christianity, if you will. One of the projects of a lot of experimental and modern Jewish writers was reclaiming Christian imagery and imagery of Jesus as a distinctly Jewish literary and artistic figure, and framing Jesus without Christian theology. I think that is part of what Gladstein is doing here, as if to say, to kind of rebuke Christianity and say, you think you have a crucifixion in your lineage. We are the true crucifixion. We are the true suffering for the sins of the world. And that is something that belongs to us forever after the magnitude of the genocide and the trauma that we've gone through. And ultimately, I love the kind of tender intimacy that this poem has with God. Even as this poem rejects God, humanizes God in ways that deny God's orthodox sort of power and agency, it's a poem that loves God, that rocks God to sleep. And ultimately, I think that is one of the best examples that we have of the kinds of consolation and contradictory theology that poetry can allow for after the Holocaust. This is a poem, I think, that allows Gladstein to maintain a relationship with God while letting go of the God that he can't believe in. So with that, I'm going to stop because we're booked from 8 to 9 o'clock. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I know that was a little bit more rushed than I had planned for, so I apologize for that. But I would love to stay and chat if anyone is interested, if that's a possibility, Noah. I don't want to keep anyone too late or anything. But yeah, thanks everybody for being here.
So if anyone has questions or comments, feel free to unmute or raise your hand or pop them in the chat. We'll give a few moments for folks to go ahead with that.
Can we have copies of the screen share?
Yeah, so I do have a little further reading document that will be sent out to everyone who registered. Yeah, thanks, Judith.
One thing that I kept thinking about going through these poems was the theological idea we have of God having a throne of justice and God having a throne of mercy. And I feel that the first poet used a lot of legal language. And I mean, I won't say he stopped short because I haven't been through all, 1,000 pages, but he seemed very ready to drag God to Nuremberg and say, like, sit, you're on trial here. Whereas the second poet, it was, much obviously like very, very religious. Even the first poem had a sense of temple service to me, which when we're talking about the Holocaust, there's that dark double reading to all of the sacrifices. And that to me almost, seemed like speaking to the merciful God in some sense, whether ironically or not. And I think this is a little compliment to you as an instructor putting this together. But the order with the last poem in particular, like we have God sitting on the throne of judgment, God sitting on the throne of mercy, God sitting this one out because God's tired. But having that follow a poem that uses imagery from Noah and the flood, that's a story where God has a very deep suffering and exhaustion because of, seeing humans doing evil. The Bible doesn't get into a ton of details about it, but moving from that into evil that we can reference and recognize and look at and see, it's believable that God might be too tired. So I thought that was great on your part.
Thank you, Noah.
Okay, is the chat all thank yous? Do we have questions here?
Bonnie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, you concentrated so beautifully on the Yiddish poetry in this country from people who, lost people in the Holocaust or came here as refugees. I'm thinking before 1939. Is that correct with these poets?
Yes, all of these, none of them were in Europe.
But I'm wondering if there's also in Israel an Israeli poetic tradition of people who either survived the Holocaust and went to Israel or were in Israel before the Holocaust, if they have the same sense of a poetic dealing with the Odyssey from Israeli poets. I don't know if you've done any studies in that, so I'm not, I don't know if that but I'm just curious that I would imagine that there is a tradition of Israeli poetry that is addressing some of the same imagery, but maybe ideas, but maybe it would also be a little different because they're in Israel. I don't know. That would be interesting too. Does living in Israel make a difference?
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal question. And you're right that there is a tradition in Israel of this kind of theological Holocaust poetry as well. So people like Dan Pagis comes to mind as a, incredible poet. I think it's different in a few different ways. One is that the medium of the language itself creates a difference. In other words, to be writing in Hebrew, it's like the medium is the message, right? And art form is content. And to write in Hebrew versus writing in Yiddish is itself a significant difference in response to the Holocaust. In part because Hebrew just has a different, more kind of overwhelming set of theological, associations and baggage with its vocabulary. But in part also because, and in part because Yiddish also has an overwhelming set of baggage with its vocabulary, because most of the vocabulary of Yiddish comes from German, the language of the oppressors. So yeah, I don't have a super well thought out response beyond that, but there is a similar tradition, and it's different in, I think, really powerful and worthwhile ways. And to my knowledge, no one has done a fuller study of the ways that Israeli poets take this up differently than, or Israeli Hebrew poets differently than Yiddish poets. And I'll also say that these are all poets who didn't survive the Holocaust. But there's also a wealth of poetry, both written during the Holocaust by people who perished in it and by survivors after the fact. And so it would also be, I think, a really worthwhile study to compare the poetry of survivors with the poetry that we've been looking at tonight of people who did not themselves survive, but sort of, witnessed it from a distance. So yeah, but this is a great question. Yeah, I see in the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I found that in listening to these poems, you just get a feeling that no matter where they are and how they relate to God in the present of their writing of the poem, the background that they have, the rich European shtetl type of background that they may have grown up in, doesn't leave them no matter what. And it's this conflict that they have almost between their upbringing and the strong connections that they still have to it and the reality of what they see in the world and maybe their change of attitude.
Yeah, I think that's very astute. All of these poets had, if not what we would consider an Orthodox upbringing, certainly an upbringing steeped in traditional Jewish texts and modes of being and modes of learning. And I think that was just who they were, and there was no way for them to let it go. However much, as we saw, for example, in Kaja Molodowski's poem, however much they might want to let it go, want to be free from it, I don't think they understood it as a possibility.
Right, it almost,
yeah.
it brings into contrast the philosophy of the Europeans that went to Israel to establish a new Jew. These poets were not establishing new Jews. They were the old Jews with new attitudes, perhaps. So I found this extremely interesting, and I thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comments there. Gary, I see you cited Leonard Cohen here. I think that's spot on, especially with some of the Aaron Zeitlin actually poems that I didn't include in this, who has this very mystical understanding of the reciprocal relationship between God and humankind. Totally. And I love this comment here about after the destruction of the temple, God comforts us. And after the destruction of the Holocaust in Glatzstein's poem, the poet comforts God. We see throughout these poems a kind of inversion of the classical relationship in Jewish texts between God and humanity. For example, in Job, the Job poem from Aaron Zeitlin, where in Job, God says, "Where were you?" And Job is silent. No, now the Jew says, "God, where were you?" And God is silent. So yeah, it's another great reading of that. Okay, well, I'm happy to, so Noah will send out, I guess, this further reading form, and maybe you can include my email address. And if people have further thoughts or comments or questions, please feel free to be in touch.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Kraft, for a wonderful class, and thank you everyone here for your participation, for being part of our learning community. I know some of this was pretty tough, not easy reading, easy listening, but I think very worthwhile for all of us. We still have another dozen classes at Drisha this week, and in a couple weeks, starting on November 15th, Mr. Kraft will also be leading a Yiddish poetry translation workshop. So if that's something that sounds right for you, feel free to take a look. If it's something for someone else in your life, please pass it along. And there is tuition, but this is Drisha. If you need tuition assistance, email me. I have our website and my email address in the chat, so you can take advantage of all of our offerings that appeal to you, and share with other folks who might be enriched by what we have on offer here. So again, thank you so much, and please be well, everyone, and hope to see you soon and learn with you soon.